welcome to Family Days 2015. I'm Rob White. I'm the Director of Parent and Family Programs, and I am the serially embedded Williams father of Katie, class of 2011, Carrie, class of 2013, and Alex, class of 2017, who's studying abroad this semester so that he won't be around for me to embarrass him this weekend. A couple of housekeeping quotes. We'll be back in here at 11 o'clock with President Adam Falk and Dean of the college, Sarah Bolton. And then you're warmly welcomed at noon to lunch at Town Field House down on the other end of campus for lunch, a buffet lunch where we've organized the tables so that you can sit with your students' entry mates and their families, and their tables for sophomores, juniors, and seniors as well. How many of you were able to attend the class yesterday? Pretty amazing. You enjoy it. Now we have a chance to hear from professors themselves what they aim to accomplish with our students over their 4 years at Williams. Once our panelists have outlined the scope of that great ambition, they'll be taking questions from the audience. If you have a question, please say it loudly so that our panelists and our video guy will pick them up. To my far left is Paul Park, a lecturer in English, an author of many well-received novels and short stories. Paul teaches courses in writing at Williams, particularly creative writing. And today he's representing all of the languages and the arts that are taught at Williams in what we call Division I. To Paul's right is Jeff Israel, assistant professor of religion, whose teaching and research focuses on ethics, Jewish American thought, culture, and politics, and the role of religion in contemporary global politics. Jeff represents his colleagues in Division II, the social sciences. And to my immediate left, and to Jeff's right, is Lee Park, professor of chemistry and associate dean of the faculty. Lee's research interests lie in materials chemistry and nanotechnology, and she's taught courses really spanning much of the chemistry curriculum here. Lee's professorial commitments are in Division III, the sciences and mathematics, and she's been leading a campus-wide conversation on the value and the future of the liberal arts generally. We'll have Paul begin, and I invite you to join me in a warm welcome.
Yeah, my name is Paul Park. You know, being a teacher is usually an exercise in fraudulence where you try to convince yourself and others that you know what you're talking about. And I feel in situations like this, my fraudulence is in two particular strains. And one is the anomaly of what I do in the context of the liberal arts generally and Division I in particular, which is, you know, I'm interested in teaching a skill that you learn how to do it and then you know how to do it. Robert mentioned creative writing, and I do that a lot, but I also do different kinds of expository writing and also, in particular, classes that merge elements of expository writing and elements of creative writing, because my sort of particular conceit is that these skills, which in many colleges are taught separately, they actually inform each other, and especially they inform each other in the kind of the essay writing, critical writing sphere, that you can learn a lot about how to write a good essay by sort of modeling it on basic skills that you can learn in creative writing, skills about narrative storytelling, how to handle suspense, how to reveal the lead or bury the lead, how it is that you can make a conclusion sound exciting and not just like a wrapping up. I teach a mixture of classes. I teach a class which is about writing about art for the MA program. We have at Williams a couple of graduate programs, and one of them is an MA program in art history. So I teach up there, and I teach, Williams is very lovely to me, and that they essentially allow me to invent every year, pretty much, a new iteration of a way of teaching a class that is a mixture of creative writing and critical writing. The other way I feel fraudulent is that my progress towards being a college student has been sort of anomalous. Robert said I was a lecturer, so that makes me different from a scholar or a tenured professor like my colleagues. The opportunity for that is to get people teaching in academia who weren't necessarily trained for that, and that's certainly sort of my case. I come to academia from, I was a squash teacher in New York. I was an antiques dealer. I wrote copy for an advertising agency. I've done all kinds of hack writing. The way I got in academia, again, seems odd to me or unparalleled to me, because I went to Hampshire College in the mid-'70s, and I got a degree like a lot of people from that institution. It was sort of an interdisciplinary macrame Cuban Revolution double major. And I went to New York, and I was writing science fiction and doing all kinds of odd jobs. And at a certain point, I got involved with a woman who moved to Baltimore, and I was going to follow her there, and the concept that we were going to live together. And when I arrived there, I realized that she had a lot of ambivalence about me showing up, and which had manifested itself she had volunteered for different things to do every night of the week, and then also Saturdays and Sundays. And so, so if I said, let's go to the movies, she'd say, well, it's Tuesday, it's reading for the blind. The blind are supposed to read to themselves tonight for your vanity. So one of the things she had signed up for was a creative writing class at Johns Hopkins, and I had never taken a creative writing class. I guess published my third novel, and I thought, well, Jesus, I'd like to see what somebody else says about this. And it was taught by a guy of a type that I later recognized, who had an MFA from a good program, but he himself wasn't a published writer. Halfway through the semester, he came to me and he said, listen, next semester I have to teach a class in novel writing, and I don't really know how to do it. I've never written a novel. Can you help me out? And so the day before the class started, he came to me, and I said, well, if I was doing it, this is what I would do. And he said, oh, please, 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 could you come and get us started off? And he gave me the address of the classroom, and I walked in, and he was sitting with the other students. He didn't introduce me or didn't say this is a special guest. And out of sheer nervousness, after about 5 minutes, I just started to talk, and at the end, he waited till everybody else left, and then he came and he said, oh, that was just great. That was just great. What are you going to do Thursday? We meet again on Thursday. And I hadn't really thought about it. And Thursday came, and then pretty much I was sort of hooked. After about 3 weeks, he stopped coming at all. The students still thought I was, this other guy. And at a certain point, my girlfriend, who was said, are you getting paid for this? After that, this fellow started to sign over the checks to me as he got them, and that's pretty much how I got involved in teaching at the college level. I've been sort of running with that ever since. So it's again, it's a sort of the purpose, I think, of lectureships is that it allows a kind of a way of thinking about disciplines that comes from outside of it, and that there's a sort of a place in that, a place for that in academia, a place for people who have a kind of a non-traditional way of entering in. Williams is a sort of an interesting place right now where we're rethinking to a certain degree the way writing is taught, especially as the student body changes, their demographic changes, their changes in the assumptions that professors can make about the expertise of students coming in, and also that sort of correspond to changes the way writing is taught at the high school level, which partly because of the importance of various standardized tests has become a very regimented and unexciting affair. So Williams now, as many other of its peer institutions have, is in a kind of a more systematic way trying to organize a system where you don't make assumptions about the skill in critical writing that students have from the beginning, but we figure out a way of guaranteeing, or at least imagining, that everybody who comes through becomes a master of this particular important skill. So for me, it's a kind of an exciting time to think about it, and time to think about how it is in sort of new and interesting ways you can make learning how to write and think critically into something that's exciting and something that somebody wants to do.
I'm Jeff Israel, as you heard, and I'm in the religion department, and also I teach in the Jewish Studies program. And I'm in Division 2, which roughly covers this, what we call social studies, and ranges from philosophy to economics and psychology, Africana studies, and political economy, cognitive science, and a range of other kinds of disciplines. And I thought I would just talk a little bit about something in the academic study of religion here that I think is just a heightened feature of all of the coursework, I suspect, on some level, in Division 2. And that is that students come into the sort of liberal arts environment at Williams with a set of assumptions about what religion is. They might have religious commitments. They might have a very deep connection to a particular religious tradition that connects them to their family and where they sort of take themselves to be coming from. And one of the things that we do in the religion department that is very complicated emotionally and intellectually is we try to look at something that's very important to the students, even sacred, and look at it in new ways, with new kinds of tools, from a distance. We tried to set up a community in the classroom that shares something in common that is the new community that's going to make sense of material that might matter in a different way to them when they're at home or when they're outside of the classroom. And that is very, very complicated work to do well, and sometimes very fraught. And in the context of the study of religion, this, of course, goes very deep into our sense of the kind of world that we live in. So that in the way that we sort of navigate our world, we take for granted that it is the way it is for good reason. And this is basically the world that's meant to be. But of course, in the study of religion, you find great expression of the human imagination that shows a capacity to imagine other worlds and how our world might be judged by those kinds of projected possibilities. So the kinds of conversations that we have in a religion classroom often challenge students, I think, at their best, with the possibility that the world that we live in is not always what it seems, is not always necessary, can be thought about from lots of different registers and levels. And an example of how we might struggle with this kind of question is, I'll take from my class, my Introduction to Judaism, which I'm teaching now, which is called Before the Law. And it centers around a parable by Franz Kafka called Before the Law. And one of the things that we wrestle with in this class is the idea of a life lived under the onus of some absolute law. What would such a life really be like? What would it really mean to feel that total existential pressure? And we read from authors, we read texts, we read stories, philosophical tracts, all throughout history trying to wrestle with this question. How am I going to meet the burden of the law? And students will come to this from a variety of different places. Some are themselves Jewish, identify as Jewish. Some have no experience with these texts or ideas at all. But what we try to sort of find our way to in this class is the weight, the idea of the weight of a law like this with a capital L. And of course, once we get to the modern period and we really take Kafka's parable seriously, there's also this sense of feeling that one is obligated to a law, but not knowing what that law is, and feeling indicted by it, and not knowing what you've done, right? And these are feelings, ideas that all come together in texts that if a student can really absorb themselves in, and then play around with and look at critically, they can start to see levels of possibility in their own world, I think, that are new and set up possibly new trajectories for their own thought and relationships and even aspirations. And that points to sort of two ideas that I would give to you about what maybe we try to do broadly here, or that I try to do anyway. One of which is what I'd like to call building educative relationships, which is an educative relationship is a relationship that you might have with a text or an idea or a language or a method of study that is good for its own sake. It's just something that you do because it's simply worthwhile to spend the time doing it. And something like the problem, the questions of the law, can be one of those things that you might come back to in new ways throughout your life. And it gives you a purchase on something, an angle from which to see things. And one of the ways in which I think we can talk about the difference between a liberal arts education and another kind of undergraduate education is that when we describe it as not entirely pre-professional, part of what we might mean is that there are things that are intrinsically valuable that you can do here. And one of them is building these kinds of relationships. And I was a religion major in college and built some of those relationships with books that I have that I've read over and over again, with problems that I keep coming back to, with arguments that I've had with my friends who I made in college that I'm still having, though sometimes we switch places in what we think about those kinds of things. But those are the kinds of things I think you can do in that classroom context. And that we hope that students make themselves receptive to those kinds of relationships. And the other thing that's related to the example of the material that I work with in the Before the Law class is giving students an opportunity to exercise their capacity for interpretive judgment, which is to say that, one of my favorite moments with students is when we have a text. We just read these Hasidic tales, these sort of magical realist tales of Rebbe Nachman of Bratslav, these sort of crazy, they seem like fairy tales, but they're mystical, and they're really interesting, amazing stories. But they're strange. I mean, we don't see texts like this, in our lives, mostly. And so, it's these short texts, and you just kind of put it in the middle of the table and say, what do we want to do with this? What do you want to say about this? Here's a thing. Here is a text with ideas and emotions in it, and all sorts of levels of metaphysical longing, right? What do you want to do with it? What do you want to say it means? What is it about in your world? What's your relationship to it? What does it say about what it means, for instance, to be obligated to something, or to be capable of imagining possibilities for a good life, or a range of different kinds of questions. What is this thing? And there's no right answer, obviously. There's only the time that's spent wrestling with those questions that I think is worthwhile for its own sake. But I also think that exercising that capacity, while it is worthwhile for its own sake, does also have extrinsic value, which is to say that one of the things that one does as a human being is get flooded with symbols and texts and meanings and people and events, and you have to make judgments about what it means, what it counts as, what you're going to do with it, how you're going to relate to it. And I think that at its best, coursework in the study of religion, and I suspect this is true for much of the work in Division 2, is an opportunity to make those judgments, but to do it in a way that's different from the judgments you see made on, by talking heads on news shows, and made in the other things that are curated as allegedly serious conversations. It's another, and I hope a deeper model for that kind of engagement and judgment. And so that students here, I think, at its best, really build a life of judgment and interpretation and relationships through this kind of coursework. And I'll pass it on to...
Now I want to take both your courses. So I'm Lee Park. I'm in the Department of Chemistry. So I'm in Division 3, which is all the sciences, the natural sciences and mathematics. So I find that when students come to Williams and they start taking chemistry courses, for instance, they often, not always, but they very often have certain preconceptions about what chemistry is, what it means to teach, what it means to learn science, to study science. And that often involves, they think it's about knowing answers or knowing how to solve a given problem to arrive at an answer, and that it's a mastery of a body of knowledge and facts. And so what I find that I end up doing in the classroom, a lot of what I spend my energy on is yes, helping them try to learn how to solve certain kinds of problems and how to master a certain body of knowledge, because that is important. But really to also show them, to teach them how to ask questions. That really what we're doing in science is no different than what we're doing in these other disciplines, which is learning how to ask questions. And in the sciences, there is a certain canon of knowledge that you do have to get through so that you can understand what the most interesting next questions are. I had a student a few years ago, who graduated a few years ago, and he said that when he came in as a freshman, having come out of high school, and he was really excited about chemistry, that he thought he knew what chemistry encompassed, right? He'd taken a couple of classes in high school, and he knew that chemistry was sort of this big, and that he figured he'd mastered about this much of it. And after 4 years of chemistry here, what he understood was that, okay, now he understood this much chemistry, but of course the world of chemistry was so much more vast than he had ever imagined. And he realized how many things that we don't know, right? And so learning how to ask the questions, learning how to figure out where are the boundaries of what we do or don't know or can be confident about, learning what assumptions you're making. Even as you answer a question, that's still based on certain kinds of assumptions, and trying to identify what those assumptions are. the other piece of what I think I try hard to teach my students is not just how to ask questions, but how to be creative. I think a lot of students, when they first come into a science class, again, you know, the sort of what's been valued in high school or how they've done well on their tests has been sort of to think about things fairly narrowly, and it hasn't always left a lot of room to explore how creative you can be in the sciences. And so to really show them how you can do that and how you can ask really interesting questions, and how even the most simple sort of fundamental principles that you learn in your second week of a chemistry course can lead you eventually to some really fascinating research questions. And that there are still a lot of fundamental things and a lot of applied things to go out there and explore. So learning how to be creative, it's creativity of a certain type. There are certain constraints. We have certain physical and natural laws that constrain us in certain ways, but nevertheless, there's enormous room for imagination and creativity. And I think sometimes that takes students a little while. That's not the way they've always thought about science. And so to show them that that's, you know, I don't sit in my office as a professional chemist. I don't sit in my office solving pH problems. But that's not actually what I do every day. Even if sometimes, for some periods of the course, that's what I'm going to make them do. So trying to show them where that leads, why, if you learn how to do this, where that leads you. So that's a huge part of what's fun about what I teach and working with the students and showing them kind of the expanse of what's out there. I'm at a point in my course where I'm introducing one of the pieces I like best to teach in introductory chemistry, but it's often the thing that often most alarms them, because often students will come to me when I get to this part of the course. They'll come to me after the second class or so, and they'll sort of say, well, this isn't chemistry, because they, with their 1 year of high school chemistry, know what chemistry is. And, you know, so they'll insist that this isn't chemistry, you know, and so trying to show them that, you know, chemistry is bigger than they thought it was, and that there are a lot of conundra, that even fundamental conundra, that they thought were sort of, they thought it was about tried and true facts, and really there are a lot of things that we don't understand very well. And so that's always fun. It's always a little alarming for them. They're not used to encountering those kinds of questions in a science class. But in fact, I think that's what we're all trying to do. So teaching them how to ask questions, how to be creative, how to think about what assumptions they're making as they ponder the natural world. So then the other thing I think I'll move into is one of the other ways that I get to teach students is not just in the classroom, but also through working closely with students in my research lab, for instance. So it's true across campus, but it's certainly a hallmark in the sciences that students can get involved in research with faculty. And so I will typically, I don't actually at this moment, but I will typically have several students working in my research lab over the academic year, over the summer. And that's really where I get to engage with students a little bit in a slightly smaller environment than in my classrooms. And they really get to see what it means to do chemistry, what it means to wrestle with a question or tackle a target, and to think about what you do when the first experiment doesn't work, which is always the case. The first experiment never works. Often the 10th experiment doesn't work. So to show them that that's really what it means to tackle a problem and to get stuck and to try again and to think of a new way of getting around it and try to be creative about that kind of problem solving. And so that's a really valuable part of what we do. It's not always counted as a regular course, depending on how students participate, but it's a huge part of our curriculum. And actually a really critical part of what we do, and an enormous part of the fun for me in teaching our students. So I think maybe I'll leave it there and open it up to questions. I can't actually see anyone,
Yep.
so.
There's a problem here. Yeah,
Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
What is the topic that you've gotten to now that the students say this is not chemistry?
Oh, so what is the topic I've gotten to? So the way I'm teaching an introductory chemistry course, and the way I've structured this course is we kind of started with a macroscopic view, and now we're down to a microscopic view, so we're going to start building up atoms and molecules and what bonds really mean. But to do that, you really have to start with what are electrons, and what are electrons gets you into the wave-particle duality of light. And so if they think it looks like anything, there are a few lectures that they think they're sure are physics. That's physics, not chemistry, and why are you teaching us this? And so also showing them that those boundaries are also somewhat those boundaries aren't very meaningful, and that actually it's this incredibly fundamental thing in chemistry and colors everything that happens after that. Everything we understand about how molecules form and where the bonds are and how you make new molecules has everything to do with understanding the electrons. Anyway, so. Yes?
Is anybody over at CERN for the supercollider?
Is anyone over at CERN? Yeah, we have had.
Students, have they gone over?
Yes, absolutely. We do have a couple of students. They have typically been physics students who have gone over and done summer internships at CERN. So I know that to be the case. I can think of a couple, but I'm not. My physics colleagues would know better exactly how many. So, yes.
So this may seem like a question only for the religion professor, but it really is directed at all three of you. If college campuses are incubators for change and for helping us find a path to be the best people and nations and world we can be, how is Williams helping in that effort? And specifically, how are we teaching students to learn how to work together forward while not compromising excellence?
Jeff, can you repeat the question, please?
It's a nice challenge. No, it's a good question. I guess what I take to be maybe a version of the question is, what are we doing here to enable our students when they graduate to contribute in a positive way, in a constructive way, to a better world, and a world that can cope with some of its deep problems. Is that?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I suspect there are a lot of answers to that question. I get one thing I'll say that maybe emphasizes something that I was mentioning implicitly in my comments has to do with learning how to talk about, deliberate about very fraught subjects. So that I also teach a class called Religious Conflict and Cooperation and Religion in the State, modern Jewish political theory. There are all sorts of incredibly controversial, hard subjects in those classes. And students see models of how to talk about those things on TV and newspapers and their family lives, and they're not all great models. And I think some of them are very bad models and contribute to the world that needs to be better that you describe. So I think one thing that we do, at least in my sphere, is, in a class period, say that's an hour and 15 minutes long, where something really heavy and complicated that's different students have different kinds of stake in, right? The process of figuring out how to represent themselves, how to listen, how to acknowledge different views, how to cope with irreconcilable differences, right? Over a whole semester, coming back again to conflict, disagreement, difference of interpretation, right? Modeling that kind of exchange, figuring out how that can be done well. What are the virtues of that kind of interaction and dialogue, I think is one of the things we do that helps them to go out into the world, when that stuff takes, and add something new and create new possibilities for the better.
One of the basic benefits, I think, of a liberal arts education is that ideally it allows you to be a little bit self-conscious of the assumptions that you make looking at a problem. We can see in a lot of our polarized political discourse and social discourse is that a lot of people are kind of bad at imagining that what they think is true is partly because a series of assumptions that they've made and that other people could, with perfect legitimacy, make another series of assumptions. In one of my classes recently, we were looking at a description of life among the Pawnee Indians in the mid-19th century in Nebraska. And there's only one sort of Western text, which was a missionary text of somebody named Father de Smet. And he described in fairly dispassionate terms the social setup of this particular group. Later on, there's an Englishman who goes through and he's mostly responding to Father de Smet's description. And he essentially says these are barbaric people, savages, and it's what a terrible life that they've led, and how much better it is now that they are sort of under the control more of the United States government. 50 years later, or more, 70 years later, there's a woman writer who's looking at essentially the same information and saying, you know what, this was a really idyllic, utopian time. People were happy in a way that is a model for us. And if you look at the argument is examining exactly the same part of the initial text, which is the revelation that in this Indian tribe, there is no difference in terms of the labor between high-status women and low-status women. That, you know, the people who are the daughters and wives of the chiefs labored like everybody else, and in fact, they seemed to do most of the manual labor of the tribe while the men were out hunting. Now, for the Englishmen, the idea that high-status women and women in general should be working in this way was terrible. It was an indication of a kind of a broken down or chaotic or disorganized social structure. But for the woman historian of the 1970s, it was completely the opposite of the so. This was an indication, this kind of equality of work was an indication of something that was to be emulated. And the idea that social hierarchies didn't really translate into different kind of labor categories. So it's sort of an example of if you are able to look going in at the assumptions you're making, you know, the assumptions of values that then color what your interpretation is of the actual facts of the case, that can be enormously liberating, and it can undercut the kind of self-assurance that is often so debilitating that we could see in our politics and our social sphere. And for me, the essential purpose of a liberal arts education is to liberate people from the kind of tyranny of their own assumptions, their own assumptions of what's true, assumptions of what's good, assumptions of what's beautiful, and all that kind of calcifies them into adulating a certain type of rigid version of themselves. And, you know, we can see this happening across all of our disciplines, this way of questioning ourselves to make ourselves less sure. Many people come to Williams College, and because it's an elite institution, because they're very, very good at figuring out what adults want from them and providing them, they come with a certain type of self-assurance. and one of the things I think we all try to do is break that out of them, and that can be very valuable going out.
Do you want to call us? Should I call? Okay. Sorry, I'll call somebody. So you.
I have a question for Division 2. Looking at the Middle East these days, are there any courses at Williams that look at the history over recent centuries of the various religions, the evolution of the various religions that have led to the conflicts that we're experiencing now?
The short answer is yes. There are. We actually have people studying the Middle East and the kinds of conflicts that I think you're referring to from lots of different angles: historical, religious studies, literary. So yeah, there are lots of opportunities for that.
Yeah.
Both of us were educated in the UK, and so we're new to the liberal arts approach, and our daughter was delighted with it. It struck me that you're providing this wonderful, isolated, deep-thinking, free place for young people to emerge as thinking adults. But I am curious as to how they become people who can cope in the world. And I'm interested to know from any of you what things happen to students at Williams that make them able to handle disappointment, deal with people who don't behave as well as others at Williams. What's it like when they get out?
Well, so the question is, it's a version of the question that we have a kind of a bubble here, and the bubble is has all kinds of advantages in terms of allowing people to sort of find themselves, find out how it is that they can imagine themselves as adults. And then at a certain point the bubble bursts and then they are in the world. And how it is in the isolation of this little valley that we could provide some kind of way of as part of the maturation process of integrating them into the larger world. Is that about right? Well, I mean, one of the basic guiding points of liberal arts philosophy is that it's not, as Jeff says, particularly pre-professional. And that I think for a lot of people, knowing that suggests that what that means is then you go out into the real world and you don't know anything. You might know something about, you might know how to argue, you might know how to think critically about a number of different topics, but nothing else. And I think that this is a kind of an illusion, well, it's a kind of a vision that's been sort of played up by the media over the course of many generations, the idea of a sort of a highly developed egghead mentality that kind of breaks him or herself when confronted with the real world. But I don't think it's exactly quite accurate. In fact, I think any good liberal arts education involves learning all kinds of skills. Certainly in Division 1, writing is a complicated, difficult skill. Music, art, theater. It's not valuable or true, I think, or language programs. It's not valuable or true to think that these are things that simply have to do with developing developing a human being rather than developing a human being with skills to engage with the world. Certainly that's true in these other disciplines as well, especially in the natural sciences. So in my experience, it doesn't turn out to be true that Williams graduates find that a hard transition to make. In fact, one of the wonderful things about teaching at Williams is the rapidity with which people who graduate from the school seem to take their place in the world, seem to find interesting and often surprising things to do. So I haven't, I regard it as a problem that's more sort of apparent than real. But I'd like to hear from the rest of you.
You want
I'm trying to think.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's, I mean, I very much agree with what Paul said. And I guess I would just add that, I don't know, in some ways I think that you could imagine two different approaches to the problem that you're suggesting. One being that, one where you want to make sure students go through certain trials in order to learn to endure them, right? Because it's a hard world out there and they need to build their resilience. And I certainly think that that is important. I think that the world even here ends up being a hard world, especially for students who, you know, to get here have just spent so much time exhausting themselves in high school to get the right kind of credentials to be able to come here, right? And then when you're in college, things happen. I mean, life is complicated for human beings no matter where they are and what the setting is, you know, relationships, things happen at home. I mean, you don't have to look hard for non-idyllic circumstances. You know, these are people, you know, after all. So my feeling is the one way would be to try to make sure they have certain trials to prepare them. The other way, and I'll admit this is more my tendency, is sort of the, you know, not to sound too, I don't know, sentimental or something, but you know, that's the kind of person I am, is the kind of unconditional love approach, which says that if you send people out being fortified with an experience of a whole, you know, team of adults whose job it is to you know, sort of bring them into confrontation with ideas and themselves and each other, et cetera, that resource, more so than sort of having lived through artificially constructed trials, that resource is going to be something they can hold on to and will come back to. And I think very much Williams students do that. They literally come back here. They come back to the friendships that they made here, the relationships they had with professors. It's a touchstone for when things fall apart to remember what it is they're all about to begin with. So, I mean, that's one way of thinking about that.
We have time for one more question. Back to, you had talked a little bit about thinking through a new way to teach expository and creative writing. And one of the reasons, one of the drivers for that was, it sounded like a lack of preparation or different preparation or different demographics that the students are seeing coming to Williams is different than it was 10, 15, whatever your time frame is there. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, as I was saying that, so the question is, when I was talking about the way teaching writing as a discipline is in a period of transition now, or a period of evolution, that the implication is that there's a different demographic that's entering the college that makes that more urgent. And as I was saying this, I was thinking it's perhaps I was saying something that I myself didn't in fact believe. I'm not one of those guys who looks back at some halcyon early days when everybody wrote beautifully and everybody was able to communicate themselves beautifully. This is a hard skill, and it's always been a hard skill, and I don't think, you know, people come to college and they're not prepared for it. And what's different now, I think, is that they're not prepared for it in new ways. So they're more ESL students now at Williams than there used to be, and that's a particular type of issue. Or they're more students who, you know, very bright, very accomplished, charismatic students who have been badly served, I think, by public high schools that are starved of resources in various ways, and that's a particular problem. So I think when when we're looking at ways in which we can change the way we teach this particular skill, it's not a matter that in some sort of larger global way the students are less prepared than they used to be because, you know, we're going to hell in a handbasket, but more that we have certain specific challenges to address that are slightly different than the challenges we had in the past. You know, because I do want to stress that there is something, there's something about the basic Williams student coming in that presents, I think, challenges for faculty. The fact that it's an elite school, we get huge numbers of students who come in because they've worked hard at doing everything right for a really, really long time. You know, they're really, really adept at trying to figure out what adults want of them and providing that. One of the most important things that we can do, and also in order to prepare them for the real world, is to try to challenge that in some way. I mean, the anguish that students have sometimes, especially first-year students, when they realize that you are not going to tell them like what they have to do to get an A. This is not part, you know, their dutifulness is not going to help them here. And that part of the purpose of the education is to is not to be able to understand the sequence of tasks that they have to do perfectly in order to succeed. That it's a deeper, more complicated thing that's happening there. And in a way, teaching writing is a sort of a microcosm of this, because many, many students have assimilated a way of writing critical essays that in fact has no purpose in the real world. You get to the real world where people are actually writing interesting things that people read. That model doesn't exist anywhere. It's a completely false model. You know, I say jokingly sometimes, you know, when I talk to the people who hate me in the admissions department, you know, if you get a more than, say, a 700 in the critical writing part of the SAT, it's not just that you're a bad writer, you'll always be a bad writer. There might be a sweet spot between like 550 and 650, something like that, that I can work with. Above that, you're doomed. Now, it turns out that this isn't so, but it's certainly so that you have to work harder with those students because they have invested so much in what turns out to be a false model. And that this is something that happens sort of across the board as well. People invest a great deal in a certain model of success that turns out to have no relevance here. And it's sad for them.
Yeah, I think breaking bad habits is a lot of what we spend our time doing. So I think that we're supposed to call it. I can't see you, Rob. Okay, so that's it? All right, thank you.
Thank you.